Welcome to Extraterrestrial Reality. I recently had a very interesting guest on my show, Preston Dennett, in the previous podcast, and he talked about a lot of different things. And one of the things he talked about was his belief that he thinks that the aliens are here, extraterrestrials are interacting with humans, and the purpose behind it is more or less benevolent. That was his feelings on that. And this guy is somebody who has written 30 books on the subject and has his own YouTube channel, investigated hundreds and hundreds of different cases, talks about them all the time. I highly recommend his YouTube channel if you haven't already checked it out. Anyway, he also talked about cattle mutilations, that his belief is that the government is responsible for cattle mutilations and not the aliens. Now I did a poll on this on both my YouTube channel, Quark Zone, and also on my on Spotify, my podcast host, Spotify, and I ran a poll on this, and the question was, who or what is behind cattle mutilations? That is, and on Spotify so far to this point, I received 31 votes, and I had three choices: the government, aliens, or aliens and the government. Well, at this point in time, aliens is winning with 14 votes, or 45.2%. Aliens and the government comes in second with 13 votes at 41.9%. And the government comes in last with 4 votes, or 12.9%. That's on the Spotify poll that I did on Spotify. And then on the YouTube version of the same question, who or what is responsible for cattle mutilations? And it was 16 people responded, and the government received 7%, aliens received 33%, and the government and aliens received 60%. And that was out of the people who voted on the YouTube. And then there was some comments under the YouTube question also. Somebody said it's both. They're unexplainable instances, missing organs with no incision. Also, the calf at Skinwalker Ranch that was mutilated a few feet away from the ranchers. That was someone, one of my followers named JD. And then somebody else, Danlit, wrote, could also be predators, cryptids, or crazy people. Esmeralda said, interesting question. I have no idea, but that was not one of the choices. So she would have picked no idea if that would have been a choice. And then here's another comment that I thought was good. It says, this was from Ivana Rios. It says, most likely your government, in my opinion. We never had that in Mexico, or never heard of any cases like that in Latin America. I think I heard one case from Brazil, but they're super rare. Seems like most cases are in your country, so that makes me think it could be some type of smokescreen your government is doing to their citizens. We had something like that with the chupacabras. The government used it as a smokescreen to deviate attention from the economic crisis we had in the 90s, but it's just my opinion. I don't own the truth. Yeah, I don't know what the truth is with regard to that. I personally, I believe that the aliens are responsible for this. I mean, based on some of the stuff that I've read, based on some of the research that was conducted by Linda Moulton Howe in the 70s and 80s and 90s particularly. So that's what I think. Again, it doesn't make me right, but I do think the aliens are doing it, and it could be for just the purpose of food purpose. I mean, they could. I mean, a lot of these cattle mutilations, it involves not only just the removal of some of the organs, but also the complete removal of all the blood. And I mean, if these beings are, some of them, like the praying mantises, for instance, or if they're anything like the praying mantises we have on Earth here, well, they're going to be flesh eaters, and they might use blood as a food source. So I think that that's possible. It doesn't make sense to me personally why the government would do this. Why wouldn't they just buy their own cattle? I mean, and have their own little ranch somewhere and do the experiments like that? Why would they go stealing, mutilating cattle on somebody's ranch without, and then that doesn't make any sense to me. But that's just my feeling. It doesn't make me right. Now, of course, like I said, Preston Dennett is of the opinion that it is the government for some purpose, and he might be right. I don't know. But in my opinion, after I think I've talked about this before. I think the aliens are doing it because some of these things are very mysterious. Like some of the incidents I read about, involved somebody seeing a healthy cow, and then with a half hour later, the cow is, the same cow is found completely mutilated, and blood drained, and there was no sign of, no sounds or anything. I mean, and there's other incidents where there were some ranchers who stayed up all night, trying to see what's going on, and they saw strange lights in the sky, a soundless craft moving around. So I don't think that our government's flying around in soundless craft mutilating cattle. I have trouble believing that. That's just me. Again, it doesn't make me right, but that was Preston Dennett's opinion. And of course, as these polls show us, there are some people who think it could be the government. Not a lot, but there are some. And there are some people who think that it could be a combination of the aliens and the government. And that's possible too. All of these scenarios are possible because we just don't have any answers really when it comes down to it. When it comes down to this, I mean, this subject is very it's very mysterious, and we just don't have a lot of answers for a lot of these things. Now, another thing that Preston talked about during the interview I had with him, he said that he thinks that the aliens are here to help us, and his experiences from all the people he's talked to, all the contactees, he gave a figure of like 90% where there are positive experiences. And that could be true. I mean, I've actually talked about all different scenarios on my podcast. I present that they could be here for that kind of purpose. That one of the things that could be going on is that they are here to. All these things make sense. Like, I've laid out before a theory that I think is plausible in my mind. That okay, when you look at some of these things, cattle mutilations, for instance, that's the aliens need. Some of these aliens are like insects and they need blood. Okay, so that explains that. Okay, again, it doesn't make me right, but that's just one aspect of it. Meanwhile, they're concerned about our progress. They look at the way we're developing, the way our technology is developing, but they see how violent and horrible we are to each other at the same time, and they're concerned about the nuclear proliferation. And we're still pointing nuclear weapons at each other, nuclear missiles. At different countries are pointing them at each other. All countries in this world just about has a nuclear missile with its name on it right now, and it's really ridiculous. And so they look at that, and maybe the reason behind all of this hybridization program is to create a race among us, because if we get too out of hand, maybe the aliens at some point are going to take over. And maybe things like the Ariel school incident, where the aliens actually speak telepathically to some of the children, maybe they're trying to warn us, hey, you got to stop doing this. Your technology is going to end. You're going to end yourselves. And maybe they don't want us to end ourselves, and maybe they don't want us to destroy this planet, and maybe that's what's going on here. It is a good purpose, but there are some things going on behind the scenes, like this abduction phenomenon, right? That might not be pleasant for a lot of people, but maybe from the aliens' point of view, they feel like they have to do this because at some point in the future, they may need to take over. That's just a theory, doesn't make me right. But, there was another podcast that I did before the Preston Dennett interview, where I talked about how these the cover-up is basically extremely detrimental, mostly to children, because when a child sees an extraterrestrial or encounters an extraterrestrial, really they have nowhere to turn. I mean, they're told that that's not true, that's not real, that can't be. You're either lying, or you had a dream, or you're whatever, or you're trying to pull off a hoax. And so I think children are, that was my argument in that one episode. I did bring that up to Preston too, and he pretty much agreed that there are, it is very detrimental to cover up to children, because when these things happen to kids, when kids see a UFO or encounter an extraterrestrial or become unwilling abductees, then and they don't know, their parents they think because the government hasn't come out with the truth, then the parents think the kids are just dreaming, or maybe their kids are mentally ill or something to that effect. So I think it's detrimental to children. But I did receive a message from somebody with regard to this. And of course, I've talked about this person before. This was a retired electronics engineer who worked for different government groups such as NASA, the CIA, DARPA, also did work for some private government contractors as an electronics engineer, and I've been in communication with this person since last year. I've talked to this person on the phone. He's a real person. I've seen his resume. I've been questioned about this before. He just doesn't want his name to be revealed. But he had an encounter. His interest really came to life back in the early 90s when he had his own encounter. And he was in his 40s. This person was in his 40s at the time. And he, after seeing this recent podcast that I did on about the effect that that children endure, he pointed out to me that it's not, children do have issues when it comes to this because of the cover-up, but also, I mean, adults have issues. And he said he actually laid out for me the problems that he had since he had his encounter. He had an encounter with something that what he described as a tall gray, maybe like looked like a bug, looked like an insect, looked like a praying mantis type of a thing that was outside of his home his former home that he had in Tucson, near Tucson, Arizona. And anyway, I'm going to read, he sent me a message, and I'm going to read the message, the email that he sent me. It says, "If you recall the first time I emailed you, I described an incident in 1997 where I saw a tall gray at pretty close range. However, I never really did consider the effect it had on me personally. Your last video caused me to ponder it, as just seeing the thing did have some serious consequences for me." And then before I get into the rest of this message, let me just refresh everyone's memory with what he wrote in the first message that he sent me, the first email message about his encounter. So this was his encounter that he had in 1997. "I mentioned that I saw something in 1997. I was living in a rural area in the hills southwest of Tucson. I was awakened one night by the sound of something scraping on my bedroom window like fingernails on a blackboard. I had a dreadful feeling that something very dangerous was trying to get in, but worse than that, I had this bizarre feeling that it was intensely hungry and needed to feed on me. I dismissed these feelings in the heat of the moment because there was no actual evidence yet, and grabbed a pump shotgun and ran to the window and flipped on the floodlights. I then saw something that I'll never be able to forget. It apparently was a tall gray. It stood about 7 feet in height, with a relatively short and thin torso, a very large head and very long legs and arms, with 3 fingers on each hand. It was moving away from the house, so I only saw it from the back, but the way it moved was incredible. The legs took long strides while the body and head remained perfectly upright and just glided smoothly along. When it reached the fence, which was about 4 feet high, it simply went right over it without breaking stride, like a hurdle jumper in the Olympics. It ran into a clearing about 200 yards away, at which point a craft of some sort rose silently up and drifted away to the south. Seen edge on, I couldn't tell if it was circular or triangular, but the bottom was radiating a yellow-orange light. Just a few seconds after it flew away, 2 Air Force A-10s came in from the west, very low, and vectored north directly over my house. I've never seen A-10s fly that low, especially after dark. I thought perhaps it knew I had a shotgun and was scared off, but in retrospect, I doubt that was the reason. I suspect it had some way of knowing the A-10s were approaching, so it decided to leave the area before they arrived. I think if it wasn't for those A-10s, I might not be here today. Because of my need for employment and obtaining clearances, I didn't report this event to anyone. There was, however, another witness to the UAP. A young man who I had met a few times was vacationing in a small trailer just to the south of my house. I met him the next day, and he reported the UAP to me without any prompting. He gave exactly the correct time and said he saw it at a very low altitude. It was an unambiguous and very disturbing confirmation of the event. A few days later, I stopped at a small cafe down the road and inquired about the young man. I was told he had stopped for coffee and his trailer hitched up and seemed very agitated. He said he was getting out of here as fast as he could, and I certainly don't blame him. In addition to that, I also found scratches in the glass of my bedroom window and some large footprints which appeared to have 3 toes. This had a profound effect on me, including repeated nightmares, boarding up my windows, and eventually abandoning the house entirely. Some people might think this experience colored my judgment, But I'm afraid that's not the case. After more than 20 years of examining everything I could find on the subject, it all seems to point in the same direction. And rather than being a mere anomaly, my own experience only serves to support the conclusion that our planet is being colonized by a species of alien parasites that feed on human and animal blood. That was his experience. I was going to stop there before I get into what he just sent me, the rest of the recent email. So, his belief is, this retired electronics engineer, his belief is that these beings are here to take over the planet and they live off blood. That's his belief. He sees this. It's a complete opposite of what someone like investigator like Preston Dennett views it. I don't know. I mean, this could be right too. I just don't know. Again, we just don't have enough information. I don't know. Again, when it comes to this subject, I don't know what's what could be right, what could be wrong when it comes to it. We just don't know. We just don't know. Hopefully it's not. Hopefully it's not. They're not colonizing the planet. Hopefully they're here for good purposes. But at that night, he felt, when he saw that creature, he thought that thing was there to drink his blood. That was the feeling he got. But anyway, he recently, after seeing that recent podcast where I talked about how this cover-up, this ongoing UFO cover-up, basically victimizes children. This is this retired electronics engineer wrote about how his event when he was 43 years old affected him. Okay, here's what he says. He says, I was 43 at the time, so at least up to that point I had a normal life. I feel bad for kids who have their lives ruined almost from the very beginning. At the time the incident occurred, my first reaction was pure terror. I've never been so scared in my life. Over the next few days, I boarded up all my windows and began to set up booby traps, such as punji boards and tripwire alarms. At that time, I didn't know they could paralyze people, so I bought more guns and kept them all fully loaded all around the house. I also stopped going out after dark. I wondered who I could call, either for help or advice, but the internet was fairly new at the time and I didn't find out much that way. I dismissed the idea of calling the police, and as I mentioned, I was working in defense electronics at the time and didn't think it would be wise to call any of the military contacts because it might jeopardize my security clearance. That pretty much left me on my own. Although the thing did not return, I was unable to sleep normally anymore. I spent many nights wide awake, then felt really tired and run down the following day. It was having some serious effects on my health. At one point, I confided to a friend what had happened, and although they seemed sympathetic at the moment, they stopped calling me and didn't want to get together anymore. So I realized they thought I was some kind of nut and I had ruined the friendship by telling them about my experience. A few years later, I abandoned the house and moved out of that area. I continued to have nightmares and would not go out after dark. As the internet developed, more information started to become available. I discovered MUFON, who I reported the incident to. They were more accepting, but of course that really didn't help. Over the next 20 plus years, I continued to find out as much as I could, and after much study and research, I came up with the theory that you so kindly read on one of your videos. Thanks for that. I can't quite explain it, but just getting the word out brought some degree of psychological relief. Now, 25 years later, I still have trouble sleeping and refuse to go out after dark. Knowing what's happening and how helpless we all are, it casts a shadow on just about everything else. I used to enjoy walking in the forest, for example, but those days are over. I seem to be focused mainly on what sort of weapons or defenses we can develop to fight off these creatures. I get upset when I hear people say they're here to help us. The facts are quite the contrary. They do horrible things to animals and people. They have assumed control of the planet and use us like a herd of cattle or lab rats to be experimented on in whatever way they desire. They seem to have some sort of ongoing plan or program, and it's a very ominous and frightening and not at all friendly or benevolent. I guess the bottom line is I'm scared, depressed, feel violated, and have a lot of latent anger. This is not the way I expected my life to be, but fate had other plans, I guess. There's something that matches up with our experiences. Now he's talking about my experience where when I was a child in 1977, of course, like I talk about all the time, there was some being that showed up in my room in the middle of the night, and it had 3 digits on its hand. That was it. Now, when I brought this up, I talked about this with Preston, as many of you know, and he related that he thinks that this was a biological android, and that these three-fingered greys are the ones that do all the abducting and bring a person to the ship. But anyway, he's talking about the being that he saw that night had three digits on its hand too. He says, I saw both hands of the creature and they had 3 long fingers that seemed to come to a point. Spooky. There were also scratches in the window glass where it tried to get in. A lot of these incidents seem to have a weird hive mentality aspect. Even with the advanced technology we see these creatures using, their behavior still seems very predatory and barbaric. I think they're just natural parasites like a plague of locusts. After all, technology is always used to satisfy the desires of the owner. And although technology may advance, those goals don't change very much. Once a parasite, always a parasite. People ate beef 5,000 years ago and we still enjoy eating beef today. If we're still around 1,000 years from now, I'm sure people will still be eating beef. So the bugs may have advanced technology, but bugs are still bugs, and bugs enjoy eating stuff too. Of course, their diet is a little different, but the logic remains the same. So he's basically stating that he believes that these things are insects and they're living off blood and they're draining the blood of these cows. And he also believes that some animal mutilations, human mutilations, are that the aliens are responsible for some of those, that this person has come to those beliefs. Again, everybody has an opinion, and this is a completely opposite opinion of what Preston Dennett presented in his interview last week. It was... totally different viewpoint. I hope Preston's right. I really do. I hope that it is for benevolent purposes. I guess we'll find out as time goes on. But again, because of the issue, the cover-up, the ongoing cover-up, we still don't have any answers, and it sucks. It truly, absolutely sucks. And I mean, I think it's you wonder how many people these kind of things happen to. And just don't report it. I mean, I've met people who had things happen to them and didn't talk about it ever. And there was an old guy. In fact, I plan on visiting a site this coming week. I want to take some images of it, and I want to do a podcast actually while I'm there. There was a guy back in. Now this was in the 90s. This was in 1997. There was this man, this old guy. He's late 60s. I was a young man at the time. I was in my 20s. And this was in 1997, and I remember it was around the time I was working on an article for a local newspaper about the 50th anniversary of Roswell, and I was also doing some local angles to that. Like I was able to find out the first UFO flying saucer sighting in this county. Like I actually found somebody. There was a report in the paper from 1947. From July of 1947 of somebody seeing a flying saucer, and I actually was able to. There was one survivor of that incident. And I was able to track this guy down. He has since passed on, and so I was doing a story on that. Him and these other guys saw, in broad daylight, a flying saucer flying over this small little Pennsylvania town in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. The town was New Philadelphia. He saw like a craft flying saucer flying over the town. And then I was working on that, and plus this story about the 50th anniversary of Roswell and the Roswell incident. I was doing interviews with people like Stanton Friedman at the time. I had talked with the people at the Air Force. They provided me a whole bunch of documentation, including the book, the Roswell Report, Case Closed. And anyway, I was sitting in a bar room. In a day, this old man, a lot of old guys would hang out in this bar room in a nearby town here where I'm at right now. This little town called Gerardville, Pennsylvania. And there was this old guy there that I used to talk to all the time when I was there. This guy's name was Leonard Ulozis. He has since passed away. And on TV they were showing, I don't know if it was that day, it was happening that day, but it was somebody from the Air Force talking about Roswell, and the press was laughing about it, and it was about the dummies and all that kind of stuff. And I told Leonard, who was sitting there, I said, yeah, I'm working on an article about that right now for the newspaper. And then he went on to tell me, well, I could talk about that kind of stuff. Because I talked to this guy a lot, but I never talked about UFOs. And he told me a story something that happened to him. And there was another witness there too, but the other witness, he told me, would never go public with this. And he saw this giant flying saucer fly back in the late 1960s, fly out of a stripping pit. There was these old in Pennsylvania, a lot of abandoned stripping pits where they used to mine coal out of in days of old. Then they leave them. They just leave them like that, and they fill up with water, and they're just sometimes people go swimming in them, and they end up drowning because there's a really hard undercurrent there. But anyway, in the middle of the winter, he was, as a security guard, was working in this area as a guarding this area, checking it out, and he was walking near one of these stripping pits that was covered with ice, and he said this giant flying saucer came flying straight out of it and went straight up in the air. His dog was complete. He had a dog named Bumsy, and Bumsy was all freaked out, and his buddy was all freaked out that was over there, I guess, walking around with him. But he never told anybody about it, never talked about it until that day. And then I tried to, when I heard this story, I was like, well, I'd like to include this in my article. And it took some doing, but I finally convinced him to do it, and he did it. But again, there's people like that all over the place that see things, experience things, and never talk about them. Nobody in the public ever hears about them because they're afraid to talk about it. Leonard at the time was an older guy. He was in tough shape at that time, from what I recall, and I guess he just didn't care anymore. I guess, you know what? He's like, you know what? I'll tell you. Basically, I think that's what it came down to. It shouldn't be that way, right? It shouldn't be that way. But again, it's like this way with this guy here, this electronics engineer. I mean, he didn't want to talk to anybody about it because, he might end up losing his job. He was working for a defense contractor at the time. And if they get wind, oh, you're seeing aliens. Oh, boy, you must be nuts. And he talked about how he told one of his friends back in the 90s, somebody that he talked to all the time, and all of a sudden that friend just stopped calling him up. So those kind of things happen. So yeah, that's it's bad. It's bad that this has been covered up for so long because it affects I do believe it affects children the worst because they have to be the most confused over this. Even as an adult, yeah, you might realize it's going on, but at least you're not confused. You understand. Well, I guess I better just keep my mouth shut because that's all I can do, right? At least you have that, even now, I would be afraid to say if something were to happen to me now, if I don't have proof of it, I'd be afraid to actually report it on here. I would even though I'm doing a podcast on UFOs, I would actually be afraid. I would be afraid to say anything because there'll be people out there saying, oh, you're lying, you have no proof. So yeah, I get it. I understand, and I think it's terrible. But again, you see this. I guess the other thing I want to point out here, there's a lot of different points of view when it comes to this. Some points of views are very, very positive. But you look at, listen to Preston Dennett. Now he does admit there are people that he's talked to, but a lower percentage of people who have negative experiences when it comes to alien encounters. So there are some that he deals with that have not, their experiences aren't good. But he says, as for the most part, he thinks the aliens are here doing up to good. They're trying to help us. They're trying to help us learn, trying to help us advance. But then you have people like this retired NASA and government electronics engineer who says things like, well, no, I think they're here to colonize. And there was actually there were some people in the government early on who believed that there was a colonization program going on back in the 50s. Well, there was reports of this. Actually, in a book by one of the first UFO investigators, Major Donald Kehoe, he talked about there was somebody within the government who basically believed that there was a colonization program, that this is what this was, that they're here to colonize the planet, that they showed up in force. That they might have been here basically for centuries, for who knows, maybe the entire time we're here, maybe they've been here. But in the 50s or the late 40s, they showed up in force, and this person was under the belief that they're here to colonize the planet and at some point basically get rid of us. Now that's again, there's all different kinds of viewpoints. Now again, I also believe that there are some people within the government that are in the secret control group that have answers to this, that have a better grasp of this than any of us, any UFO researcher out there, and anybody, because they've been studying this more closely. They have had access to the bodies, to the alien craft. I'm sure they had to learn something. They had to come to some kind of consensus, right? So that's why it'd be nice to know what that consensus is, good or bad. Right, because we're adults. The human race has grown up, right? The human race is getting older here. We're getting wiser when it comes to this kind of thing. I think people are ready. I think people could handle it now. So it would be nice. It would be nice if we could get to if we end this cover up. I mean, I'm tired of it. I mean, we're seeing. Well, I'm getting tired of just the banter on Twitter. It's getting tiring. It's getting tiring. We're having the same names back and forth, going back and forth with each other, but we're still not getting anywhere. It's again, we're stuck like we're stuck in the mud. We can't get out. Like it's like being trapped. We're just spinning our wheels. We're not getting anywhere, and it's very upsetting. So, yeah, I believe that it's that if this cover up is hurting so much. I mean, again, we should know, good or bad, what's going on. We need to know, right? I want to know because I don't know. I mean, I can sit here and speculate on this podcast, and I'll keep doing it, right? I'll keep presenting different cases, keep providing different opinions that I have. I hope to keep bringing on different kinds of guests as time goes on. I really enjoy talking to people like Preston Dennett, people who have researched this subject for basically their whole lives. I think that's good to keep talking about it, but and to normalize it. This needs to be normalized more. That's the other issue. I mean, it's not crazy. It's not a crazy thing. It's a real thing. They're here. There's just too much evidence at this point. There's mountains of evidence that the preponderance of evidence shows us that there's an extraterrestrial presence here. It does the debunkers and all that kind of stuff, right? The lies from the government, that doesn't really. We know that the government's lying. We know that the debunkers don't have any idea what they're talking about. They really don't mean anything when you really think about it, right? They really don't. It's useless. I'm sure I'll talk about them debunkers again, but really, what's the point, really? I mean, it's like talking about flat earthers every time. But every now and then, I'm sure I'll talk about them when I get mad about it. But at the same time, we need to come to an end here. We need to get the information out. We need to know what the government knows, what the secret control group knows, and then let's move on from there. Anyway, until next time, thank you very much for joining me.